I used to do home care for an elderly lady with learning disabilities and no eyes. They were removed due to a congenital condition. She was lovely, but prone to wandering around her flat at night in total silence, which led to several horrifying situations where I left my room at 2 a.m. only to encounter her standing silent in the hallway, turning her eyeless face towards me. I work security through my college at a local hospital. The only creepy thing I remember is when a dead man moaned. One of my duties was to help wheel patients who had expired down and into the morgue house. Once we were wheeling an older man from the ER down, and halfway down the hallway, he let out this low moan. I started to panic, thinking that he was coming back to life, but the RN explained to me, newbie, that sometimes the air in the lungs doesn't come out until some time later, or it is delayed for a bit. But nevertheless, it still creeped me out. I used to work in St. Bart's Hospital in London, which, in parts, is over 1,000 years old. One of the buildings had 2 floors with massively high ceilings, and so the floors were taken out and then later rearranged to make room for 5 separate floors. The nurses, working night shift, would often tell me of a ghost of a night nurse who wandered silently doing her rounds at night, but due to the new floors, only her head would be visible drifting down the ward. I have quite a few stories. Most of them are hilarious, and then there are those you never want to think about. What fucked me up the most was when I saw how the eyes change at the moment of death. Imagine you are looking at clear water, but the clear water changes to foggy in an instant. In my 8 years here, I've only seen this once, and I've personally saw well over 250 dead or dying people. That is the worst sight I have ever seen. One of my more creepier experiences was when I had a lady in my hall that was actively dying. I found out that most of the time, when the dementia folks are in the process of actively dying, they babble. It's weird at first, but you eventually get used to it. This lady didn't babble, she was completely silent, and still it managed to creep the fuck out of me. Other than that, I went along with my usual system of checking up on her every half hour to make sure that she was clean and somewhat comfortable. On my last check of her, before leaving for the night, I had just cleaned her up and I had my back turned as I was emptying out her garbage when a hand reached out and grabbed my wrist. I turned around to see this tiny old lady sitting straight up on her bed, staring at me with a death grip on my wrist. She didn't say a word and just laid back down and went to sleep. That fucked me up. One of my aides I worked with said that one time she was doing a post-mortem care on a patient who had been on many anticoagulants before death. She said that when they turned her on her side, the woman began to bleed out of every orifice. Eyes, nose, mouth, and even her ears. She said her and the nurse went home after that and had nightmares for a week. I work as an ICU nurse. A mid-20s female came in with some serious cardiac abnormalities and then went into respiratory distress. Never had any medical history at all. We had to put her on the ventilator, but she was on just enough sedation to keep her lucid. She could nod or shake her head yes and no appropriately to questions, but one night, a patient in the room next to hers died, but her body was still in the room, about to be taken to the morgue. The female patient's door was closed and curtains drawn, so she couldn't have seen what was going on next door. When I went in to check on her, she had this look of sheer panic on her face, trembling. I asked her a series of questions to see if she was cold or hot in pain, etc., but she denied all of them. I asked her if she saw something. She started to aggressively nod her head yes. She wasn't on any drugs that would make her hallucinate, so I went on to get more details on what this thing looked like. After playing 20 questions, I got this. A man, pale white, left arm missing, heavy, bald, standing still behind me. This was the man who had just died next door. I spent the rest of the night consoling her. I used to work as an STNA in a nursing home. Worked third shift throughout my university. During the night, we turned half the lights off so it was darker for the evening and didn't get a lot of light in the residents' rooms. We had one resident who was younger, in her 70s, and was mostly in for mental reasons. She had long, dark hair and was very thin. I was sitting at the nurse's station at the top of the hall and heard a call light go off. I stood up, looked down the dark hall, and on all fours, straight out of the ring, this resident was crawling up the hall towards me. The other STNA had forgotten to put the bed rail on, and the resident was very good at climbing out of her bed. Needless to say, I needed some new breeches, and my heart was racing a mile a minute. I work in palliative. Most deaths I've seen have been more or less peaceful, though the ones that are not stick with you. One guy was silently screaming through the last few hours of his life. Another guy, who up until this point had been relatively unresponsive, reached up and grabbed me when we attempted to lower his bed to turn him. One time, while doing post-mortem care, I walked into the room and thought, that's weird. How come nobody has closed his eyes yet? He had that movie-perfect dead look, with pale, blue staring eyes and slack jaw and all grayish, waxy skin. I closed his eyes and started the care, and when I looked again, those eyes were still staring at me, were slowly opening, one slightly slower than the other. He groaned when we turned him to wash his back, and his hand managed to clamp onto the bed rail, and we had to pry it off. When we finally got him onto his back again, there was a foul-smelling, oily, black, viscous liquid on his pillowcase. I cleaned his mouth again, thinking it must have come from there, but his mouth and nose were clear. The best I could figure, the stuff had come from his eye. I couldn't wait to get that bag zipped up. I got the opportunity to shadow nurses and surgeons for 2 of my class periods in high school. I never really experienced being in the ICU before. What was creepy for me was seeing just how many unconscious people were fighting for their lives. I followed a nurse to a major heart attack patient. This guy was put under an induced coma, but his eyes stayed open. The nurse had me help put gel over his eyes. It's been 3 years, and I still have this dead gaze stuck in my head. I also had to help reposition the guy, and it was like trying to move an extremely stiff mannequin. Seeing a human in a not-so-human state is extremely uncomfortable, and indeed very creepy. A 9-year-old girl came in once. Her parents had been finding her dolls hanging around the house with belts or strings tied around their necks. She later went into a rage and held a knife to her own throat. They brought her to the hospital, and during her psych evaluation, she said that she heard voices in her head, telling her that she was stupid and telling her to kill herself. She said she didn't want to, but she had to listen to the voices. I couldn't sleep for weeks after that one. Fourth year nursing student here. My story is more sad than creepy. I was sitting for a 28-year-old woman going through alcohol withdrawal. Day 3, the worst day. Sitting is when you sit at the patient's bedside because the patient is in danger to themselves and others. She was in full restraints, hands, feet bound to the bed, so she couldn't physically hurt me, but she kept calling me an ugly nigger and spitting all over the room. After a while, she started hallucinating. She thought that she was in the car and I was sitting in the front seat, her 2 kids in the back. She talked about her kids for a while and then started screaming and telling me to take the wheel. This scene went on for about 10 minutes of her explaining in vivid detail the car crash that had happened and how she had killed her own son. When the story was over, she kept crying and apologizing to me and asking me to pick up her son's dead body and give it to her. She was given IV sedatives, but when those wore off, she had the same hallucination again. It replayed about 7 to 8 times over the duration of my 12-hour shift. It was extremely unsettling because after hearing the story a few times, I could tell that this was something that had actually happened, and that she was replaying the horrifying memory in her head over and over and over again in her delirious state. Poor woman must have suffered so much. I'm glad she finally checked into a rehab program to detox, but it's sad to think of the long journey she has in front of her, living with that fact that she had killed her 7-year-old son. Hey guys, Gote here. I want to thank you so much for listening to this video. And if you want to check out my social media, or my other channel for that matter, everything is linked in the description below. Have a wonderful day, stay safe, and if you have a loved one working in hospitals or healthcare, give them a big hug the next time you see them. They go through a lot. Love you guys, and I will see you in the next episode.